Hey everyone, and welcome to a brand new video. Tonight we have 10 horror stories, a little bit over 2 hours in total. I hope you all enjoy them. If you do, please be sure to drop a like rating. Let's aim for 1,000 likes. Subscribing if you're new is also very much appreciated, as I post content just like this all of the time. My sinuses have absolutely been kicking my butt, so I've been doing my best to still create as much content as possible, but for those of you that also struggle with sinuses, you know how absolutely miserable spring can be, so I am currently dealing with that. So if my upload schedule does get a little bit rocky, that is why. But yeah, anyway, thank you all for the ongoing support. Enjoy the video, and as always, I hope you all have a great night. She likes to watch me a lot. I figured that out during the first 4 months after her death. I was really creeped out when I saw her the very first time. After we got back home from the funeral, I thought I was dreaming. But now it has become a norm, part of my daily routine, to watch her standing in the corner drenched from head to toe, skin white as a sheet, a few curls of wet hair on her bloody forehead with those eyes. Those goddamn hollow eyes. She never tries to do anything else, to make contact or to speak. I don't even know if she can. But she sure exploits the hell out of the one thing she can do. Stare. Following my every movement with those wide saucer-like eyes. I have never tried talking to her, afraid that I might actually get a reply. I haven't told anyone about this. It's not like they'll believe me, and also I don't really have anyone to confide in. I was always the shy and reserved type. Didn't have many friends to play with. She, however, was the opposite. Popular, outgoing, beautiful. Even when we looked the same, I was always the other sister. Not that I had any problem with that. We even celebrated our birthdays differently. She would have this big frat party, and I would spend the whole day reading books in my room. So to figure out why she would take such intense interest in me now is beyond me. The incident happened 5 days before our 16th birthday. She was drunk after coming home from a party at 3 a.m. and for some reason decided to take a swim in our backyard pool. Stumbled and hit her head on the railing of the pool stairs and fell straight into the water. No one realized what had happened until after the next morning my mom saw something floating in the pool from the kitchen window. That was our Lily, with wide eyes awake and a bloody wound on her forehead. Our dad had passed away from cancer 5 years ago. My mom raised us alone, and she was doing a good job at it. She would take us to movies whenever she got the time from work and tried to be as involved as possible in our lives. She wanted us to live the life she promised Dad we would have after he was gone. Lily's death was hitting rock bottom for her. It took her so long to cope up with Dad's absence, and when things were finally going back to normal, Lily died at the fresh age of 16. It looked like the whole town showed up for the funeral. I wondered if I would have had the same impact. I also wondered if there were silently wishing I should have been dead instead. If Mom wished for that. I never made more a difference into other people's life anyway. Lily, however, held a much more important position. All her classmates were there that day. All of her close friends delivered painstakingly long eulogies. Her boyfriend Mason didn't deliver one, but his eyes were a deep shade of red. It was not like I wasn't sad, but I wasn't particularly affected either from her death. After Dad's death, I had become somewhat numb to the idea, as if accepting it as part of life. You might label me unhinged for that. We also never spent much time together. Never did things people expected teenage girl twins to do. We both had come to terms with the fact that we were polar opposite. Sometimes I even forgot she's there. It really has been that long. Then I look up and meet those eyes and the rest of her soulless face. I do wish she goes away someday. I don't think I can tolerate her being around when I actually start having a life, whenever that would be. Even now, while I'm finishing up my homework, she's here, in the corner of my room, doing what she does best, staring at me. The rest of her body isn't as solid as her face. It's almost translucent, merging into the darkness. She is still wearing the dress she wore when she drowned, not the one from the funeral. It is thoroughly soaked, but the water never drips on the ground. I close the laptop and go to my mom's room to ask about dinner. She's fast asleep or passed out drunk. I could never tell. I picked up my phone to order a pizza when I noticed a text on my screen. Do you want to hang out? It was from Mason. Mason and I had barely exchanged more than 20 words with each other throughout the time he was dating Lily, and none after she died. So my surprise was legitimate when I saw his text. Why was he messaging me now? I looked up, contemplating how to turn him down, and I caught the eyes of my sister, holding the same expression, only it looked like this time she knew what I was up to. I considered the possibility of her reaction. I actually accepted Mason's offer. Would she finally do something? Would she finally speak to me or try to scare me off? I think I wanted to find out. Sure. Where? Mason was visually surprised I had taken up his offer. He looked better than the last time I saw him, but that was again my sister's funeral. And of course she was here too, but this time, rather than standing in the corner, she was sitting next to him, but her eyes were still on me. I wonder if Mason would run if I told him he could touch his dead girlfriend's arm by just moving a bit to the left. So, what's up? Nothing much. I just realized that we never really talked after she passed away, you know? I mean, I know we didn't talk much before either, but I figured we should have. It would have helped to cope and stuff, but I guess we can do that now, if you're okay with that. I felt like telling Mason that I didn't have to cope with anything after her death other than my mother's breakdown, but I didn't want to break his spirit, and also not to sound like a condescending bitch. It wouldn't hurt me to try and open up to people. Lily had such big things planned for a life she didn't get to live. Maybe I should finally wake up and start living mine. We talked for an hour more after that. It felt a bit awkward, but it wasn't that bad considering we had barely exchanged a word before. I noticed I can actually hold a conversation with him without boring him to death. I went to bed that night feeling good, and I couldn't remember the last time I ever felt like that. The next few weeks were a blur. I hung out with Mason a few more times. Mom was drunk and depressed for most of the days, and Lily was still keen on drilling a hole into me with her gaze. I don't know if she was mad about mine and Mason's friendship. She still had the same damn expression, still lurked around the corners as usual. But sometimes I feel like her eyes have changed, like there is some kind of emotion stirring in them for the first time. Or it could be just my imagination. I never know. Tonight, Mason invited me for a movie night at his place for the first time. I knew what might happen if I go. I don't know how I feel about that, but I guess it's time for me to go out of the non-existent zone for once. It's been 2 years since Lily's death, and she would have wanted him to move on too. I went to his house and talked for a while, and then settled down to watch the movie. He was acting a bit nervous than usual, and I think I knew why. Half an hour later, my suspicions proved correct when I felt him grabbing my hand. When I turned around to face him, he tried to lean in, but I, however, didn't see his face. What I saw was Lily just behind him, staring with wide, accusing eyes. I don't know what hit me. I jerked my head away instantly and stood up. He thought it was because of him and started apologizing profusely. I cut him off and grabbed my keys, stuttering something about curfew and going home. There was no curfew. He knew it, and I knew it, but he let it go. On my way back home with her in the passenger seat facing me sideways, for the first time in my life I realized I felt trapped. I caught a glimpse of what my life could be, and I realized I didn't want her in it. I gripped the steering wheel hard and turned to face her, and with all the strength in my lungs screamed, "What do you want?" This was the first time I ever spoke to her. Her eyes got wide, wider than they were before, and in the faintest voice she whispered, "You." A shiver shot up my spine, until up to this point, at the back of my head I tried convincing myself that I was imagining her, that she wasn't real, that if I tried hard enough she would go away, that I just wasn't trying hard enough, but not now. Not now that I've heard her. She was real. She was here, and now I heard what she wanted. I was still in shock when I realized I was still driving, and I was still in shock when I realized there was a huge truck coming my way, and it was not slowing down. I woke up feeling disoriented. The car was totally shattered. There was blood everywhere, and my knee was bent at a weird angle. But it didn't hurt. I looked around me. It was still dark. She was still sitting at the same place, only this time her skin wasn't translucent, and it didn't look like she was disappearing into the mist. It looked like she was actually really back. "Get up," she said. This time it was not a whisper. The first day's the hardest one. Have you ever gotten that feeling that everyone around you is in on something that you aren't? Or that all of your friends are just paid actors? The Truman Show mentality, you could call it. Well, when I tell you it's about to get so much worse, you'd better believe me. About 1 year ago, I had to put my grandmother in a nursing home. I couldn't take care of her anymore, so it was really the only option. Despite my deep disgust of nursing homes, she'd gotten Alzheimer's, and it was just too much to handle anymore. I couldn't give the care that she needed. Anyways, that's despite the point. Shit really started to hit the fan when I began visiting her every Saturday. The first time was, I don't know, maybe a month after she was in the place. I walked up to the building's big fancy doors and rang the buzzer. "Name?" a female voice asked, irritated. Here for Susan Bartley," I said into the speaker. "Come on in," the woman said, and the door clicked. I swung the thing open and walked into an empty room. There were old people playing games at card tables in a large room right behind the reception desk, and a few other adults my age sitting at small couches waiting for their loved ones. "Over here," the woman at the desk waved. I smiled apologetically. "Sorry about that. I've never been in here," I justified to the woman as I approached the desk. "I'm here to see my grandmother?" "Yes," the woman responded, scrolling down a computer screen. I looked past her in the game room and noticed two elderly people fighting with each other. I cracked a smile. "She's in room 204. The elevator is right down that hall." She pointed left. "Okay, thanks," I said, then walked off. But I couldn't help but notice something about the woman behind the desk. She was dark-skinned, but had bright gray eyes. They were beautiful, but strange. I took the elevator up, which smelled very strongly of old people, and then approached my grandmother's room. I knocked quietly on the door. "Come in," she yelled. I couldn't help but laugh at that. Her hearing was fine, but she screamed at everything anyway. "Hey, Grandma," I said with a wave. She grinned. "My favorite grandson," she demanded, and so I gave her a hug. "What brings you to this miserable place?" she asked as I sat down on a recliner. She was watching a cooking show on the television set, and she was sitting on a chair with her arms crossed. The walls here were tan and white, and there was a window behind me. We both sat in recliners that were way too close to the television. and I found them to be unexpectedly comfortable. "I wanted to see you, duh," I remarked. "Stop being a smart aleck," she waved with a smile. We talked for about an hour, right up until the sun had completely set behind the horizon and the glow coming through the shades had ceased. "Visiting hours are over," a man said, peeking in the room. He too had gray eyes, but I didn't notice it at the time. I said goodbye to my grandma and then left. On the way back to my house, I noticed that there was something off about the place. I couldn't quite place it, but it felt weird and it smelled weird. And the people were all kind of mean and just not right. It was unsettling, but I tried not to think too much about it. I went back the next Saturday, buzzed in, spoke with the same woman at the reception counter, and met her steely-eyed gaze, only for a moment, but long enough to send static up my spine. It was a sensation that I'd never quite experienced before, one of both fear and defense. Something primal. I tried to shake it off and took the elevator up. My grandma and I talked for about an hour before I finally got the courage to ask her the question that had been on my mind all week long. "Hey, I have a question," I said. "Shoot." "Does this place seem a little weird to you?" I quietly asked. She furrowed her brow. "Are you high?" "No," I laughed. "It's just that these people here seem so strange. The workers, I mean. They're just upset that they have to work," she explained, "like all young people." "Yeah, probably." I nodded, but I didn't believe it. "It's 8. You should probably go before they kick you out." She pointed at the clock. "Yeah, you're right." I laughed, then said my goodbyes. On the walk to the elevator, I saw a worker come by with a chart that contained medications for all the residents. I gave him a friendly wave, to which I was ignored, but I looked at the cart as he walked past. There were jars of cloudy water on the bottom shelf. A few were empty, but most were full. I'd never seen anything like it. It certainly didn't look like any sort of medication. When I saw the man walk into another room, I decided to wait. I had to see if they were giving that shit to my grandma. After about 2 minutes, the man came back out, and sure enough, I could see that one of the jars had been drained. It meant they were giving this mysterious solution to the patients. I almost spoke up about it, but the man skipped my grandmother's room altogether and went to the room next to it. Is this some extra treatment that I have to sign up for? I wondered to myself. The elevator finally dinged and I stepped inside. My thumb went to the ground floor button, but I hovered. I shouldn't have cared. I should have just left it alone because they weren't giving my grandma anything bad. But that stuff in the jars, I was experienced with medications and nothing looked like that ever. So I hit the basement button instead, where they were bound to keep all their medications, and down I went. 1 ding, 2 dings, basement. My gut was pulling me forward at this point, directing me to the source of all my suspicions. It was a feeling I can't explain. I think some of me just knew that something was wrong. The elevator door pulled itself open, and the elevator flooded with air so humid it might as well have been rain. I began to cough into my arm, attempting to be as quiet as possible, until my lungs could get used to it. Surely this place has to be a health risk. The amount of mold down here must be astronomical in this environment, I thought to myself, and the air was really salty. I stuck my head out of the doors and blinked the tears out of my stinging eyes. To the left of my elevator was an endless hallway, and to the right was another long hallway with a door at the end of it. A very suspicious looking door. I looked left, looked right, then left. Empty. Nobody. So I sprinted out the elevator like any inconspicuous person would and aimed myself at the door at the end of the hall. About 10 feet away, I could tell there was a sound emanating from the other side of it. It slowed down and tried to stop my heavy breathing to listen. It was almost like the sound of dominoes lightly tapping each other. I pressed my ear against the wet oak and listened further. The sound was noticeably different, like two rocks being firmly ground together. Then suddenly I began to hear footsteps far behind me. I reared my head around. I couldn't see anyone there yet, but I ducked through the door right next to the weird one and closed it behind me. My heart was pounding in my chest. It felt like there were eyes on my back, and the feeling of suspense sat firmly on my chest. I could still faintly hear the dominoes in the other room. The footsteps grew louder, then louder, and they stopped right outside the door. I heard a door handle twist, then a creak. He was opening the weird door. I could tell because that horrible sound began again. It made me want to puke. I don't even know why. It was like nails on a chalkboard, or a knife on a plate. Either way, the sound of dominoes, rubbing skin, and grinding rocks almost sent my dinner all over the floor. All I could take deep breaths to overcome the nausea and hope that whoever was out there wouldn't open this door. A moment passed and I heard a thud in the other room, like something hit the floor. Something wet. The clattering, grinding sound became louder and faster instantly. Then the door closed. The worker walked away. When the footsteps faded off into nothingness, I wasted no time throwing open the door, running back to the elevator, hitting the button and getting the hell out of there as soon as possible. I tried as hard as I could to look cool and collected while walking through the waiting room and out the door, but I know I failed miserably. That night, all I could think about was that sound, that horrible, horrible sound. I felt like I should know what it was, but I just couldn't place it. I knew that my grandma was all right though, because she wasn't getting any of the cloudy liquid. Another weekend visit passed, then another. Each time they skipped my grandmother's room and she was not given the water. In fact, my grandma seemed to be doing better. Her memory was slowly becoming sharper, like the Alzheimer's was just fading away. I'd secretly hoped that she'd be able to come out of the home eventually, but on the 6th week of my visits, I did my usual routine. Walk in, attempt a conversation with the robot lady at the counter, then walk up to my grandmother's room. We watched a show, relaxed, the usual. I must have been extremely tired that day because the next thing I knew, I woke up and the room was dark, only lit by the television. My sunglasses were over my eyes. They'd slipped from my head while I slept. I looked over to my grandmother and nearly shit my pants. On the ground, at her feet, there was the most disgusting-looking creature I'd ever seen. Not even a nightmare could create such a horror. It looked like a big crab, but it had a thin layer of skin stretched over it. The long legs were bony, and the shell protruded from the skin at the joints. And the torso head, whatever the fuck you want to call it, was much bigger than a normal crab's. It looked like someone stuck a tire pump in it and then just kept blowing it up. And by far, the most horrifying thing about it was the eyes. Human eyes. Gray eyes that stared blankly at my grandma's foot. I tried to move, tried to bolt up to save her and get that creature away because those eyes looked so familiar. And I just couldn't place it, but my legs wouldn't move. My arms wouldn't move. It was completely paralyzed. The crab then began to slowly climb up her leg, leaving bloody scratches in its wake. It stared at her face with wonder and approached it. It climbed up the side of her spindly arm, on her shoulder, then onto her head, wrapping its legs around it in a vice grip. The bottom of the thing's torso was positioned right over her face, and to my horror, I saw two spindly columns of moving flesh descend from it. They looked like nerve endings, searching around for who knows what. But then they found the eyes. They pried open the lids, slipped up and behind her eyes, and 2 seconds later dragged my grandmother's eyes right out of the sockets, stem and everything. The creature climbed to the top of her head and began to pull. The sound of a breaking boulder and a falling tree, snapping, twisting, creaking filled my ears, and the top of her head came right off, like a lid, like the hood of a car. The bulbous torso of the crab then opened and enveloped her brain completely. I don't know how, but it fit all of its legs in there with it and set the skull back where it was initially. There was no mark, no blood, no scar, nothing. And then the bloody sockets in her head filled up with gray, confused eyes. I felt something crawling up my leg then. I looked down and saw one there, looking at me with those horrible eyes. This one was faster. It was over my face in an instant. I couldn't move, no matter how hard I tried. Was she conscious then, too? No, her eyes weren't open. She didn't know. She couldn't have. Nobody should see this. Nobody should have to feel those spindly legs grinding up against your scalp and vice-gripping your head, seeing pink tendrils of flesh coming to take your eyes away from you like I was. Nobody should smell that smell. A smell that I recognized because the entire place smelled like those fucking things. But by dumb luck, I was saved. The tendrils hit the sunglasses over my eyes, searching around a little bit, and found nothing. The tendrils sucked back in, and the crab did nothing for a second. 2 seconds. 3. The creature turned itself around on my face and skittered down my arms and legs to the floor and out the door, lit only by the blue television light. The next thing I remember is waking up in the room, sunlight pouring in. My grandmother gone. I shot up like a gun. Knocked on the bathroom door. No response. I ran out of the room, down the hall, then took the stairs to the first floor and approached the reception. My grandmother. She's gone, I frantically stated. The woman showed no expression. Susan, correct? She threw a fit during games this morning, so we had to take her to the infirmary to check her out. The doctors think it's the Alzheimer's, the woman explained. I almost told her that I knew she was lying because I would know if my grandma got up for games that morning. I was there in her room, but she didn't know that. And she had gray eyes. She was one of them, so I bit my tongue, faked a sigh of relief. Thank God, I sighed. I could have sworn it was getting better, I exclaimed. That happens often. It seems as if they improve, but then it gets worse. We'll contact you when we can see her again, okay? The woman reassured, but her voice was flat, eyes empty. Okay, I nodded, then walked out of the building. I probably should have felt fear then. The things I'd seen, they should have sent me into a form of shock that would have made me catatonic. The sight of that thing on my grandma was burned into the back of my eyelids. But all I wanted to do was send the place into flames. All I wanted to do was kill all of those creatures. They took my grandma from me, stole her away, and they'd done it to plenty of others, which meant I had to find out what the hell was going on. I had to find out what that noise in the basement was, what the water is for, everything. I knew that most of the patients there had dementia or Alzheimer's, and I'd seen many of them around. They always looked lost and confused, and they all had gray eyes. Most likely these creatures would take a brain, but you'd have to get used to it. They'd be stupid at first, which would let them blend into the population easily because looking confused and lost was standard. And the workers are trained. They're the oldest and smartest ones, but still not all that smart. I guess that the receptionist was the smartest of them all because she was seen by normal people the most often, but she obviously wasn't all that smart either, otherwise she would have noticed that I didn't leave last night like I was supposed to. Poor memory, poor at reading emotions, just creatures without hearts and one primary goal, to replicate, spread like a disease. I had to stop them. I had to kill them. in that room in the basement, the one that stranger had opened. There had to be more of those things in there. The sound would match perfectly. The skin rubbing, the clanking of exposed bone. It all made sense. So I laid out the facts. The basement was humid and the air was salty. They were parasites using their host for nutrients. So they could eat human food. And that water in the jars, it was most likely saturated salt water. That's what it looked like, at least. And it would make sense because the basement was also salty. The things love salt and water. They have to. Without it, they die. There was only one path forward. I couldn't burn the place down. That was for sure. Otherwise, the people who hadn't been taken over by the crabs would die. And there would be no reason for that. And the cops wouldn't listen. No way. They'd call me crazy. I would have to kill them with the one thing that kept them alive. The salt water. I could poison it. I'd just need a nurse's outfit. Their memory was shit, so I was confident that they wouldn't recognize me. As for the poison, there was one thing I could think of that would do the job without being suspicious. Nitrates. Simple as that. Aquatic animals go into nitrate shock and die when they get too much of it. And as a bonus, it couldn't be traced back to me. There was a high probability that the host would also die during the process, which was technically murder, but that didn't stop me. I wouldn't wish the curse of living on anyone who'd had to experience such horror as what those creatures produced. Obtaining the outfit was child's play. All I did was lie to the receptionist and tell her I forgot my wallet in the room. And I was in the building. A short trip to the laundry room later, and I had clothes that were just my size. I slipped the scrubs over my body, then picked up the purse I always walked with. Inside of it was fertilizer and a pair of sunglasses. I was ready. Slowly, I progressed down the hallway with my sunglasses on. The receptionist looked at me and I held my breath, hoping she wouldn't realize. And she didn't. I was right. They can't recognize faces. I resisted the urge to smile like a maniac, then stepped into the elevator and pressed the basement button. I descended one level and once again the humid air rushed in. I rubbed my eyes for a moment again, trying to blink the tears out of my eyes, then took a left out of the elevator. The footsteps from the other week came from the direction I was now going, and so I watched the labels on the doors for anything having to do with medications. Unluckily for me, however, the rooms were not labeled correctly. One just had a bunch of glass containers in it, another had piles of clothes. And then I came upon one room that spiked my interest. There was something inside of it, shuffling around. I pressed my ear to the door and was able to hear the sound of jar lids being screwed on glass. I took a deep breath, thinking about what I was going to do. Confidence, I told myself. And then I knocked on the door. Sound stopped behind the door, and then it swung open. There was a blond man there with silver eyes looking at me blankly. I quickly looked behind him and saw the jars full of liquid. I was prepared to bullshit my way through it, but I also had no idea how to do that. Did these things even use words to communicate? Can they detect lies? Will it recognize me? What want? The man asked, speech slurred like a drunk. I pointed up. She told me do this. I pointed, copying his speech. He gave a slight nod, then walked out of the room and further down the hall into another room. His gait was asymmetric and strange. I closed the door and got to work immediately. I put as many beads of fertilizer as I could in each jar, and loaded them onto the cart. The only issue was the fact that non-residents wouldn't get this water. But no, the real plan wasn't even for the residents. The real plan was to get the ones that were alone. The ones in that room. To kill them was the real plan. I filled the last jar, stashed it on the rack, and turned around. Gray eyes met me. It was the receptionist. A bolt of electricity ran down my spine. The hairs on my arms stuck straight up. "What are you doing?" she asked me. "Fill jar," I pointed. The woman stared at me for several seconds. "What are those on your face?" Her voice was as monotone as ever. "I don't remember you." "Body knew," I responded, hoping she wouldn't notice the beads of sweat on my face. The woman suddenly inhaled forcefully. "You don't smell," she speculated. "Take those off," she pointed. "Yes," I responded, voice shaky. I knew she could kill me, but I took those glasses off anyway. I couldn't think of another option. And when she saw that my eyes were blue and not gray, her face showed genuine anger. The only emotion she'd ever shown. "Liar," she screamed. Her hand was around my throat in an instant. She pushed me up against the table, my back bending over the edge of it at an excruciating angle. I clawed and punched and pulled, and nothing was working. Her grip was strong. Her eyes flared. Her forearm rippled with muscle. My hand found my bag, gripped the roach killer spray I'd brought. I slammed the cap on the table, laid my finger over the nozzle, aimed at her face. I almost couldn't push the button down. My vision was almost completely black. But the woman's grip loosened, and after a few seconds, when my hearing returned, I saw her squirming and clawing at the ground. "No," she screamed, covering her face. And then with the sound of a breaking boulder, the top of her skull came clean off, rolling along the floor. The crab which resided in her head frantically squirmed out. It tried to run away, but instead just ran into walls, and it eventually collapsed and squirmed there. It was quiet. It made no sound but that of rubbing your arms together. Then silence. It was quiet for a moment then, while I coughed so hard that I felt my eyes were going to pop out of my skull. I could hardly breathe. I dragged myself off my knees with the help of the table. Every limb felt tingly and weak, but I didn't give up. I couldn't give up. I wandered out of the room, using one hand to support myself against the wall, and the other to carry the 2 bottles of roach spray I'd brought along. Slowly, the door at the end of the hallway approached. The fresh can of spray was ready, so as I came upon the oak door and the horrible sound of clinking bone and rubbing skin on the other side, I threw some duct tape over the nozzle button, opened the door, and threw it in like a grenade. There were hundreds in that room. Hundreds. I'd only gotten a glimpse, but it was more than I wish I would have gotten. A sea of eyes and skin-wrapped crabs. The door slammed shut, and I could hear them all squirming around each other. I could hear them scratching at the door desperately. But a minute later, they were all dead. They were all dead, and it was time for the rest of the show to commence. After walking back to the medications room, I grabbed my purse and wheeled the squeaky cart down the corridor. It was so quiet, I remember. So peaceful. And thankfully, one near-death experience was all I had to experience that night. Once I got to the main floor, it was a piece of cake. I just handed the cart over to another employee, and the creatures began to die. I myself patrolled the complex, peeking into rooms and often finding a crab dead on the floor. Every once in a while, there would be one that was normal, a human that was still, well, human. It made me glad that I didn't just burn the whole place. As for the other employees, well, I just sprayed them as I found them. By 10:30 at night, they were all dead. Well, maybe the basement was an exception, but I wasn't going down there again. I picked up the phone at the reception desk and dialed the police. 911, what's your emergency? The operator asked. We need assistance at the nursing home off 5th. There were infectious crabs that took over everyone's brain and now they're all dead. I explained. You know prank calling is a crime, right? The operator scolded. I'm not joking. They're all dead and the ones that are still human have nobody to take care of them. Come if you want, or don't. I said, then set down the phone on the desk. And then I went home, and I slept better than I have in my entire life. My grandma may be dead now. I may have killed her, or maybe I saved her. Maybe I saved yours. No, I wasn't going to say anything about any of this. I killed them all and that was it. Nothing else to say, no reason to spook anyone or start a conspiracy. But the other day I was at a grocery store, walking around and looking for the cheap freezer pizzas when I saw a small sampling station. I looked down at the sample as I walked by with my cart and then heard a voice. Hello, she said, bright and cheery. I looked up to see a young woman staring at me with gray eyes. Would you like to try a crab cake? About 1.5 years ago, I was in a terrible car accident that put me in a coma. Doctors say that I had so little brain activity that they thought I would never awaken. They said it was a miracle that I did. But that is a lie. The year I spent in the coma was not as peaceful as one would expect from how little activity there was in my brain. Rather, it was a time I spent as a prisoner. I lived out a life more horrifying than I could have imagined, in a world filled with creatures out of humanity's worst nightmares. Even thinking of the things I remember from that time sends an icy chill down my spine. No matter how much it scares me to remember these things, I need to share what happened and warn the world about it. Right after the accident happened, I bolted up in my bed, heart racing, and I thought the accident was just a bad dream. As I calmed down, I glanced over at the clock on my nightstand and saw that I was going to be late for work. I quickly showered and ate breakfast before rushing out to my car. It was then that I saw them. I would try to describe the creatures I saw roaming the empty streets, but there will never be words that can do them justice. I froze when I saw them, thinking that I was still in a nightmare, and tried to wake up, but I found that I couldn't. It was then that one of the abominations saw me and charged. I hoped that I would wake up right before it reached me, but I didn't. I felt claws ripping into my flesh and heard the sound of my limbs being torn off as I died. Then I woke up in my bed, heart racing before seeing that I was late for work. As I rushed out of my car, I saw my head on the ground, face frozen in pain and terror. I tried to sprint back into my house, but I was caught before I had made it more than a couple feet. Once again, I felt myself die as the monsters ripped me apart. Once again, I woke up, heart racing. I looked out the window, uncaring of the time, and saw the creature still outside. I spent the next month hiding in my house before I ran out of food and starved to death. The remainder of the year was spent in an endless cycle of dying and waking up. I tried as hard as I could to escape, but nothing helped. One day when I was hiding in my house, I suddenly woke up to find myself in a hospital bed surrounded by doctors. Some of you may be wondering why I am telling you my story after escaping the nightmares, but there are some things that just don't line up, making me question if it was truly a nightmare and not reality. First, the date on my watch is the nightmare matched the time when I both fell into the coma and when I woke up. Correct to the minute. Second, after I woke up, I began to see the monsters from my nightmare out of the corner of my eye. Third, I still fall asleep and find myself in the same twisted version of reality that I spent in a year. Sometimes I even wake up to find deep scars that weren't there when I fell asleep. And finally, the most convincing thing is that I am not the only one to experience this. I have spoken to others who described the nightmare perfectly, and even saw the same things out of the corner of their eye. That could be passed off as our imaginations playing tricks on us, but it still doesn't explain why we saw the exact same thing at the exact same time. Combined, This makes me believe that we have lived through isn't just a dream, but rather another version of reality. One that we can never truly escape. Elizabeth was cold. Her car, a 7-year-old Mustang, had been sitting outside the bar for hours, and now it might as well have been made out of ice. The wind was howling, and the short walk to her car was enough to chill her to the bone. It had been a long time since she had closed down a bar with one of her girlfriends, and she could feel a serious buzz from the martinis. It was a 30-minute drive home, and she was not looking forward to it. The bar, Tim's Tavern, was buried in the woods outside of Lancaster, Pennsylvania. It was a relatively quiet place, full of the sort of people that lived beyond the suburbs. They mostly kept to themselves, which is why her friend Sarah had suggested it. She wanted to catch up, not get picked up by guys. The last call had been at midnight, and by the time they finally walked out, it was just past 1. It had been a rough year for Elizabeth, and she was glad to have a night out to decompress. Sarah had been a friend since college, but it had been a year since they'd last seen each other. Elizabeth's father had passed away from cancer the week after their last meetup, at some forgettable pizza place in the city, and she hadn't been able to really talk about it to anyone since. Her father had been her best friend, Sarah being a close friend. Elizabeth was happy to have had the chance to talk about her father, about the crushing feeling of loss, about the memories that brought fresh tears. It had broken her heart to sell his '65 Mustang, bright red and all original. The car had been his pride and joy. All those rides had taken as a kid had come flooding back, and the poor guy she sold it to got to watch her break down and sob uncontrollably as he took the keys. She still missed her father so much. So she put her frigid shifter into drive and pulled out of the parking lot. Elizabeth couldn't help but notice the roads were empty, the street lights few and far between. She hopped, skipping the last oil change didn't come back to haunt her tonight. There was no cell reception out in the boonies. Elizabeth could feel the wind as she drove. It was causing her to swerve ever so slightly every time a gap in the trees gave her a gust. Her eyes kept darting to the speedometer, as she couldn't afford to get pulled over after the drinks. She found herself getting sleepy and cracked a window, the cold air helping her stay awake. She was about halfway to civilization when she saw the headlights in her rearview mirror. The car was moving quickly, and the headlights grew larger and larger as it approached. She guessed the guy was doing well over 80, and the speed limit was 45. The road was full of curves and had no passing lane or shoulder, so the guy was just going to have to wait to get past her. With her window cracked, she could hear the engine howling as the car came up behind her, tailgating so closely that she was afraid there would be a collision. Snow was starting to fall, and between that and the pitch-black road it was hard to make out the car or the drive behind her. The driver started blaring his horn, and now Elizabeth was scared. She didn't want to pull over. For all she knew, the guy could have followed her as she left the bar. She kept her eyes on the road ahead. The hills were beginning to level out, and she knew the bridge that spanned the Susquehanna River was close. In her rearview mirror, Elizabeth watched as the car behind slowed briefly, then surged forward and rammed her. Her Mustang shuddered and swerved, but she kept it under control, and she pushed the gas pedal to the floor. The car might have been old, but it was still fast enough, and she started to pull ahead. She watched the speedometer climb to 60, then 80 as the road grew straighter and straighter. Finally, she could see the bridge ahead. On the other side was the highway, cell phone reception, and safety. She risked a look in the mirror just in time to see the car rushing up again and tapping her bumper. Softer this time, but still enough to throw the car off balance. Elizabeth kept the pedal to the floor. Soon she was doing 110. Her eyes focused on the bridge as it neared. Something seemed off. The bridge was half dark, with only the left side illuminated. No traffic was coming to either direction, so she might have blocked the road and tried to flag someone down. Instead, she continued, the bridge soon beneath the car's tires. The car behind her surged forward one final time, but Elizabeth kept accelerating, and it couldn't quite keep up. When she hit the bridge, her speedometer read 135. The snow had stopped, and she could finally get a good look at the car chasing her. The car was an older Mustang, first generation. Elizabeth's car shuddered, but the car behind her was several yards back. She tried to make sense of it, and wondered if she had broken something pushing her car too hard. The wind up on the bridge had her swerving all over the road, but she kept the car accelerating anyway, trying to put as much distance between herself and her pursuer as possible. She felt another shudder, this one much deeper. She realized that the bridge was shuddering, not her car. Behind her, she could see the older Mustang was starting to slow, and she saw a section of the road she had just came across disappear into a black void. The bridge was beginning to collapse. Her car's engine was screaming as Elizabeth crossed the end of the bridge. She was going so fast, she dared not glance at the speedometer. In her rearview mirror, she could see the bridge slowly swallowed by darkness as sections fell into the raging river below. She pulled her car over onto the shoulder and glanced at her mirror. The car chasing her was nowhere to be seen. It had either vanished or gone down with the bridge. Elizabeth got out of the car on shaky legs and watched as steel and concrete collapsed into the icy water. The police arrived about 20 minutes later, along with fire trucks and an ambulance. Elizabeth had called 911 immediately and reported the bridge collapse, and the police were already busy blocking the road and calling for more support. Elizabeth didn't tell them about the car that had been chasing her, the car that in the end had saved her life. She didn't tell them because just before that car disappeared, it had passed under the streetlights, and she had been able to catch the color. It was bright red. I've been a biologist ever since I was 22 years old. I grew up on a farm in rural Illinois, so nature has never been a stranger to me. Playing in the woods was how I entertained myself growing up. Spending all my time in a forest as a child, people expect me to have stories about Bigfoot or strange noises, or finding some weird shrine out in the middle of the woods, but no. The weirdest thing I ever encountered was a bobcat screeching. It sounds just like a woman's dying scream, and yes, to everyone who's ever claimed to hear a skinwalker or goat man screeching in the woods at night, I promise you it was just a bobcat. The truth is often mundane and disappointing. I think this would mean I had gotten bored of the woods, but I never really lost my true love for them. Nature is boring. That's why I like it. You know what to expect. That's why after college, I decided to make studying nature my full-time career. I'm a biologist for the Sierra Club, specialized in the ecosystems of Midwestern America. Fish, birds, deer, elk, bear, wolves, and the like. I've spent weeks in fire towers, cabins, campsites, always miles away from civilization. I'm usually gathering data on local wildlife, measuring for pollutants, determining whether the ecosystem is stable or if anything threatens it. The work is not glamorous, but I enjoy it. And nature had still never surprised me until my last assignment. I was designated to be stationed alone in the cabin on the Ozarks. The assignment was supposed to last 3 weeks in May. The Sierra Club was alerted to a steady decline in the local elk population over the last decade. Nothing drastic, but enough to raise concern. The job was to take census of the local wildlife, measure for pollutants, the usual. These are my diary entries for my assignment. Starting with my first night. I arrived in the evening in early May. Nothing was amiss the first 2 nights. It seemed an assignment like any other. The sounds of the forest were exactly what you'd expect. Crickets, an owl's hoot, and the occasional elk call. I was sent here in May because that's their mating season. The elk are out and about looking for dates, and that makes them easy to count. Elk mating is pretty straightforward. The female lets out a call, then waits for a male to find her. Usually it's first come, first served. If you catch my drift. If only, right? It was clear that love was in the air, and for all the calling, you'd think I would start seeing elk. But by the second day, I still hadn't spotted a single one. The third night, I was lying awake in bed uneasy. Something wasn't sitting right with me, but I couldn't put my finger on why. I was about to nod off when a female call cut through the night. I sighed. That was the second time that night I'd heard her. What, are the fellas having a guy's night or something? And that's when it finally hit me. I shot bolt upright in bed. For the last 3 nights, I had heard nothing but female mating calls. That should have drawn every male within half a mile. Now, elk are not discreet and they don't beat around the bush. When that male gets to the female, well, let's just say that the whole forest will know about it. I sat in bed, staring out into the night, pondering. There have to be males close enough to hear this female. So after 3 nights of her calls, why haven't I heard the main event? The third day, I went out into the trails, once again looking for some sign of elk in the forest. What I found was not encouraging. About a quarter mile from my cabin, I was trekking down the trail when I noticed something 30 feet into the woods. A large, brown, fuzzy mass lying in the bush. I smiled. An elk taking a midday nap. I took out my binoculars to get a closer look. It was an elk, all right, but my smile dropped when I realized that the brown, fuzzy mass was completely still. I carry a hunting rifle with me for safety. I readied it and approached the elk carefully. It looked fine from where I was standing, but I nearly dropped my rifle when I rounded to the animal's front. It was carnage. The poor creature had been completely gutted. What little remained of its entrails hung loosely from its chest cavity. The ribs had been pulled apart, and huge claw marks scarred its flank. Its head was barely connected to its body by a few weak strands of flesh. I heaved and almost lost what little breakfast I'd had. It was horrifying. I had to take a few moments to collect myself. This was the first time that nature had surprised me. What could have possibly done this? I've studied wildlife for years. This was a bull elk in its prime. It would have stood 9 feet tall alive, a king of the forest. There is no predator on this continent that could have taken down a full-grown bull. Pack or no pack. Even a grizzly wouldn't mess with something this big, and bears are mostly scavengers anyway. My mind raced through possibilities, trying to think of an explanation. Maybe it had been sick. Maybe a predator came upon it in its sleep, took it by surprise. Yeah, that must be it. It couldn't have fought back, but this savagery, those claw marks were bigger than even a grizzly's, and its ribs. No quadruped could have exerted leverage on the ribs to split them like that. You would need arms. A chilling thought occurred. A human. Could humans have done this? But why? Hunters would skin it, or take the head at least, to mount it on their wall. It's some psychopath out here dismembering wildlife for fun, and that still wouldn't explain those gruesome claws. Whatever this was, it needed to be reported. I was sent here to investigate the elk population declining, and this has to be related. I fished out my camera to take photos. Having to document the horror from every angle was heart-wrenching. The look in its eyes. This elk had been terrified when it died. I went to take one last shot. Just as the shutter clicked, my ears registered something. A sound from behind me that my camera had nearly drowned out. I whipped around. I had barely heard it, but it was there. A twig snapping. My camera hung from my neck and my rifle from my shoulder. I dropped the one to snatch up the other. Idiot. I thought to myself as I pointed the rifle towards the sound. I had been so shaken by the thought of the body, I had completely overlooked one important fact. The kill was fresh. The corpse didn't even begin to decay. The elk had been dead no more than half a day, and that means whatever killed it may still be nearby. With my rifle still trained on the spot, I backed away towards the trail. My hike back to the cabin was the only time in my life I felt scared of the forest. Trees surrounding me on all sides, no visibility. I jumped at the slightest sounds, never lowering my rifle, never going more than 5 seconds without looking behind me. I felt like prey, never knowing where the danger would come from or when. I didn't relax until my cabin door was closed and locked behind me. I spent the rest of the day inside my cabin, shaken. I readied my photos and sent them to my supervisors. They would take a day or two to respond. Until then, my plan was to investigate during the day and with my rifle ready. That night was my last night at the cabin. I was getting ready for bed when I heard a female elk call again. The first one I'd heard that day. And close. Very close. Wildlife don't like buildings. They smell of fire and metal and gasoline, all unnatural to them. They steer clear. What was this elk doing so close to my cabin? I peered out my window into the dark of the forest. No sign of her. She must have been beyond the tree line. I grabbed my rifle. Of course, I wasn't going to shoot the elk, but I might send a few shots into the air to scare her off. It would be nice to know the elk are breeding normally, but I could do without front row seats. I unlocked my cabin and took a step onto my porch, rifle still in hand. My eyes scanned the tree line looking for the female. That's when a pair of antlers stuck out from behind a tree. An elk's head following them and turned pure right out at me. But this was a buck, probably attracted by the female's calls. This was promising, but all the more reason to scare them away. I raised my rifle to the sky and prepared to fire. That was when the elk flew into the air, or its head did. The buck's head sailed in an arc towards me and landed just feet away from my door. I stood there in shock, trying to process what had just happened. Something, or someone had been holding the head and had just thrown it. I nearly pissed myself in fear. I pointed my rifle at the tree where the buck's head had appeared. The night from my cabin barely reached. Were my eyes playing tricks on me? Had I just seen claws retreat behind the trunk? I was frozen. I reached to behind me to open my door and get back inside, but I was too scared to turn my back on the forest, or even take a hand off of my rifle. After a few seconds, I finally gathered up the nerve to brace the rifle against my shoulder. My finger still on the trigger. I groped behind me until my left hand found the doorknob, never taking my eyes off of the tree. Thank God the door had not locked behind me. With my left hand, I turned the knob and pushed open the door, then drew it back to my rifle. I backed away quickly into the cabin, slamming the door and locking it. I hurried to the windows, drawing all my blinds and making sure each was locked, never letting my rifle out of arm's reach. The terror I felt as I approached each window, never knowing if there would be someone or something on the other side of the glass staring back at me. There hadn't been, which was almost as unnerving. I rushed to the satellite phone to call the sheriff's office at the base of the mountain. The relief I felt when they picked up. "You need to get up here," I pleaded. "Who is this?" It was the sheriff's deputy on the other end. I'd met him and the sheriff before beginning my stay at the cabin. "It's me. I'm the guy stationed up at the cabin on the mountain." "Oh, sorry about that. What's the problem?" "There's someone up here fucking with me. Get up here now." Whoa, slow down. You mean like kids or something?" "No, it is not kids. Someone up here just threw a decapitated elk head at my cabin." In my panic, I'd somehow kept the awareness to use the phrase someone instead of something. I didn't want this guy to think I was drunk or crazy. I just needed him to get up here. Well, what did they look like? How many were there? Did they have guns? I have no idea, man. They killed a goddamn elk, cut the head off, and threw it at my cabin. Just get up here. Okay. Lock yourself in there. We're on our way. Man, please stay on the line. I'm scared here. I really was terrified. I wanted someone to stay on the phone with me, even if it couldn't help me. The man replied, I can't get to you and stay on the line at the same time. I'm calling the sheriff now. We're on our way. Just lock yourself in and stay there. The man hung up. I swore I was alone again. A female elk call rang out again. This time it was even closer. It sounded like it was right outside now. I took up my rifle again. That's when the tapping started. While I was talking to the deputy, I hadn't been watching the windows. The sound was coming from the window to the right of my front door. My eyes widened in horror. A single gray claw was tapping on the right edge of the window. Just one claw. Whatever it was attached to wanted to stay out of sight. The claw stopped tapping. Instead, it drew itself along the window and out of my sight, leaving a long, ugly scratch. The sound was horrible, but it didn't stop when it left the window. I could still hear it dragging along the wooden walls of my cabin. The creature was scratching through solid wood. Could it break through my windows? Why didn't it? My knees shook. I tracked the sound of the scratching with my rifle. My mind raced. Could this thing get in? How long until the sheriff showed up? I was high up on the mountain. The drive up here took 45 minutes. Even if they hurried, it might be a half hour. Even if they did get here, could they stop this thing? Should I make a run for my truck? No, whatever that thing was, it could get to me before I got the truck up and running. Something nagged at the back of my head, but I could barely think. The scratching was louder and louder. Whatever this thing was, I had torn a bull elk to shreds. How could I stop it? The bull. That's when I realized it. The head. It was the same head as the bull I'd seen earlier. It had the same scar down its right cheek. This sound was taunting me. It must have been there when I found the dead elk. It had been watching me, and now it had thrown the head at me. Was it telling me to go away, to get out of its territory? I gasped with the mind racing. I hadn't noticed that the scratching had stopped. Where was that thing? My eyes darted from window to window. No sign of it. Until the loud thud right above me. It's on the goddamn roof, I thought. Its footsteps echoed through my cabin. Between each step came rhythmic taps. No doubt from its claws. Was it testing for weaknesses? Was it merely toying with me? It had only been a few minutes since I called the sheriff's office. I was still far from safety. I hadn't moved since the call. The thing on my roof thudded from spot to spot. The sound was starting to wear off. Focus. Think, I told myself. The thing had probably seen me through my window. It was right above me. The bathroom. The bathroom was the safest spot. There were no windows. If it does break in, it will have to look for me. Then break through the bathroom door. That might buy me an extra minute, and it might save my life. The creature knew where I was. I had to try to change that. I slowly slipped off my shoes, keeping my rifle trained on the roof. I kicked a shoe towards my bed. Sure enough, the thuds on my roof followed, stopping right above the spot where my shoe had landed. It's tracking me. I slowly shuffled to the bathroom, not raising my feet, afraid to make a sound. Praying that the door would not creak, I opened the bathroom, preparing to lock myself inside. I was shutting myself in, hoping that I wouldn't die in this bathroom, when I heard a loud scratch followed by a dull thud. It had jumped off the roof. It was on the ground again outside the cabin. Why? Was it going away? I was afraid to hope that maybe it had gotten bored. Maybe it had found some other prey. That was when I heard the woman scream. I gasped and covered my mouth. How was that possible? No one else is up here. A hiker, a camper maybe. The scream came again. Help! She cried out. I gripped my rifle, crying now. I was frozen in fear. That thing was out there. That thing was out there, chasing some poor woman, and I was too cowardly to help her. I just wanted to stay in that bathroom, hiding, hoping that every second the thing spent chasing that woman was another second closer to the sheriff getting here. I don't know how long I sat there, cowering. Another, more desperate scream. Help me! There was something in her terror. She was more scared than I was, and there I sat letting her die. My shame overcame my fear. I gripped my rifle tighter and left the bathroom. I marched to the door, ready to face whatever this creature was. Maybe I could distract it, buy time for her to get away. Maybe the sheriff would find her, even if the thing got me first. Just as I was reaching for the doorknob, she cried out again, a pained, dying scream. I was too late. The thing had gotten to her. I was a coward, and because of that, she was done. The woman moaned in pain, this time just a few meters away from my door. This must be her final moments. And I listened, safe in my cabin. She groaned once more, but this sounded different somehow. It was... My eyes widened in shock and realization. I drew my hand from the doorknob, as if it had burned me. I had never unlocked it. Thank God. The moan came again. This time, unmistakable. That was not a moan of pain or terror. It was an entirely different kind of moaning. I backed away from the door. You motherfucker, I muttered. You almost got me. It all made sense now. There was never any female elk. Mimicry is a common adaptation in all ecosystems, both for prey and for predators. This thing, it let out female elk cries to draw in males, and then, well, I had already seen the result in the forest. That's why I never heard the elk mating. There was no female waiting for them, only this monster, and now it was trying the same tactic on me. I nearly sobbed in terror. It had tried to lure me with the sound of a woman in distress. It thought that might draw me out. When that didn't work, it switched to its tried and true method, a mating call. I aimed my rifle at the door. The moans continued, louder and more intense, building into a climax. I was nauseous at the thought of whatever it was out there, squatting in the dark, mouth agape, emitting this pervasion of a woman's voice, trying to draw me out into the dark and rip me apart just like that elk. I stood with my rifle trained at the door, not moving. I had resolved that I was going to stand there until the sun rose or until the sheriff came. And the moment I saw this thing, I was going to shoot it. I don't know how long I stood there among the echoes of that sick creature. Eventually the moans puttered out, and I was left in silence until the tapping began again. In the same spot as before, there it was. That single gray claw tapping on that same spot where it had scratched the glass. But then a second claw joined it, and a third. It drummed them along the glass, slowly, ever so slowly. A patch of gray fur poked out from the edge of the window. Time stopped, and the creature brought its face into full view. It was terrible, like a sloth, but its mouth and nose were caked in blood. It had tiny, beady eyes front-facing, a predator's eyes. Large, pointed ears, almost like a bat. Thin, cracked lips. The monster looked right into my eyes. It cocked its head, and then it pulled those terrible, bloody lips back into a smile. its razor-sharp teeth still stained with blood and flesh. I'll never forget them. It pointed that hideous grin at me as it drummed those claws on my window. Shoot, shoot, shoot! I told myself, but I was frozen. This thing was going to kill me. Light poured through the front window. The monster disappeared out of sight. The sheriff and deputy had arrived in their truck. The two of them sauntered up my porch and knocked. I had to shake myself out of my stupor and open the door. Both of them backed off and drew their weapons at me, screaming at me to put the gun down. I was still in shock. I think the only thing that kept them from shooting me was the terrified look in my eyes. They asked me what the hell was going on. I could barely speak. I just kept frantically repeating that they needed to get inside, that it was still out there. They eventually told me to come with them down to the sheriff's station. At first, I refused to leave the cabin. They sort of half-dragged, half-walked me to the truck. They said I was like an owl the whole ride down, my head on a swivel, always scanning the tree line for it. I must have fallen asleep after I got to the station. I woke up the next morning in a cell. I was confused and disoriented. I nearly wept from fear when I finally remembered everything I had been through the night before. The sheriff and deputy sat me down in a room and asked me what the hell happened that night. I was silent at first. I didn't know what to tell them. If I told the truth, they'd think I was crazy. They asked me about the elk's head that I'd told them about during the call. It was gone when they got there. Just a bloody stain on the ground where it had been lying. I made up a story, said that some kids were prowling around my cabin making noises, trying to scare me. I called the sheriff's office because I thought I saw one of them with a gun. The sheriff only made me go over the story once. He seemed satisfied. He took me back up there the next day to collect my stuff. In broad daylight, of course. Sure enough, there were deep scratch marks along the side of the cabin. The sheriff didn't look at me. Kids, he said. We collected my things quickly and hurried back down the mountain. I reported to my supervisors that it was probably overhunting causing the population decline. They would never believe the truth. The sheriff saw me off while I was waiting for the bus to take me back home. He shook my hand and drew me in for one of the manly half-hugs. He gripped my shoulder. "Don't come back," he whispered. I gave him a confused look. He stared me right in the eyes. "It knows you now. Has your scent, seen your face, heard your voice. You got away once. It won't happen again. So, don't ever come back." That was 3 years ago. I burned the clothes that I had worn that trip, so there's no way they'd end up near the Ozarks again. Never been back anywhere near the Ozarks. And anyone who's ever asked me, I always tell them to steer clear. I spent so much time trying to forget what I saw that night, but that face, I remember every detail. It's kept me up so many nights with so many questions. What the hell was it? Some freak of nature? A mutant that somehow survived past infancy? Something supernatural? An alien? Those ears perfectly crafted to detect minute sounds, just like a bat. That explains its mimicry. It grew up in that forest hearing the elk calls. After a while, it learned to copy them. I've spent so many nights asking myself, how? How did it know a woman's voice? I tried to ponder the answer. When sleep finally comes, I have nightmares. Nightmares about campers sitting around their fire, when all of a sudden they hear a voice calling out to them from the woods, crying for help. The voice in my nightmares, calling them into the darkness of the trees, away from the safety of their fire. The voice. My voice. It's not that he's a bad roommate. No, it's not that at all. If he was inconsiderate and doing things like leaving dishes and dirty socks all over the apartment or playing death metal at 3 a.m., then maybe I'd feel justified in my dislike of him. If there was just one discernible grievance that I could explain without sounding immensely childish, then maybe I wouldn't feel so unsettled by his presence. But there's not. At least, not a good one. So I've kept it to myself until now. Let me preface this by saying Dave is polite, quiet, and clean. He's never been late on rent, and he always takes my boundaries into consideration. That might make it sound like he goes out of his way to avoid me, or that we never interact, but it's not like that. I talk to Dave more than I have my past roommates, and our conversations are pleasant. Never once have I had to argue with him. Dave just seems introverted, as am I, and we respect each other's space. If we are in the common area together, we'll sit and talk. We've even binged a couple of Netflix series together since we both are into the horror genre, though I've had to tap out a few times. Dave's stomach for gore is much stronger than mine. So, to surmise, for the past year, Dave has regularly sat next to me on a ratty, thrifty store couch just shooting the breeze, and I've enjoyed our conversations. I'm telling you all this because I know that when I tell you what my problem with Dave is, everyone is going to try to tell me that I must have a problem with something else. I know that you'll try to tell me I'm just focusing on little things because there's something else, something about his personality that unsettles me. But there's not. After almost a whole year of living with this man, I can safely say there isn't a single aspect of Dave's personality I find off-putting. I look forward to our Netflix nights and think he is quite funny in a dry sort of way. He doesn't really do anything that would typically upset me. One of my biggest pet peeves from past experiences with roommates is when they take something of mine. Batteries, clothes, money, without asking. Dave has never intruded on my personal space or stolen anything from me. Honestly, it should feel like I've hit the jackpot after my last roommate, Ryan. He ruined the sink by pouring hot grease down the drain and bailed before fixing the damages. Ryan also had his girl over almost every night, and they were so loud that I received notes from the neighbors. Now, Dave's not asexual by any means. He's a couple years younger than me, 24, and like clockwork, he has a different woman come over every 2 weeks on Saturday night. The first month he'd lived here, he'd given me a heads up that he'd had a date. I immediately was reminded of Ryan and became worried that I'd gotten another roommate from hell, but no, I was thankfully wrong. Each date night, Dave had some random girl stumble through the front door. Maybe the girl will wave at me or say hello, and if they do, that's the only thing I hear out of them. It's completely quiet after they enter Dave's room. I work from home, so I often sleep in late, especially on the weekends. Dave knows this, and honestly, I'm surprised by how much he takes this fact into consideration. I've already got a pair of noise-canceling headphones, purchased during the Ryan era, and I honestly don't mind wearing them to bed twice a month, but there's no need. Well, there's no need on his date nights. The other nights, well, I'll get to that in a moment. The point I'm trying to make is that Dave is so respectful, I have never once been woken up by one of his one-night stands leaving. In fact, I've never even seen one leave. Dave is just that considerate. He keeps that entire part of his life as quiet as possible for my sake. He always makes breakfast the next morning. At first I thought it might be as some sort of apology to me, maybe thinking he'd been too loud or made me uncomfortable with his Saturday night antics. Even though I assured him as long as I don't have to hear it, I don't care what he's doing in his room. But now I think it's some sort of ritual, maybe a self-congratulatory thing. Either way, every other Sunday morning I wake up to the aroma of meat frying. Dave keeps the fridge stocked up well with excellent cuts of meat, and he seems to love cooking, even if he doesn't eat much. Still, his largest smiles are reserved for sizzling meat. The nights after he gets lucky seem to be when he really gets into the chef zone. We have a meat grinder, just a small countertop appliance, and Dave uses the grinder to craft the most delicious sausages every other Sunday. He often shares his food with me, not stingy in the least, but he's particularly insistent that I partake on these mornings. I asked why once, and he simply said that the meat is best eaten fresh. He seems to replenish his ingredients on Sunday mornings, though it's not exactly clear where he shops. I've never seen cuts quite this color or texture at our local grocer. I'm pretty sure there's pork sausages, but they taste different. Softer and juicier. If Dave opened a restaurant, I'm pretty sure he could be a billionaire. Dave's kindness makes me feel guilty. He shares so willingly and never oversteps any of my boundaries. None of my other roommates, and I've had 5 by this point in my life, have ever looked so happy to eat breakfast with me. Dave won't even let me pay him back for the meat, which I assume must be expensive due to its quality. But he just smiles and says that it's much cheaper than I'd think. Writing this out, I realize how petty I sound. Dave gives from the goodness of his heart, whereas past roommates, cough Ryan cough, stole food from Tupperware with my name written in bold capital letters. Still, I think I'd take Ryan over Dave any day, and the reason is so stupid I don't even want to admit in this Reddit thread anonymously. The thing about Dave is that he chews too loud. I know I'm going to be flooded with comments suggesting things like wear noise-canceling headphones, listen to music, or the good old, are you seriously that put off by his chewing? This kid is sharing food and working on eggshells so that you don't feel uncomfortable. And yeah, I can see where those comments are coming from, but you don't understand. It's every night. I hear these noises through the walls, headphones or not. It's this crunching, slurping sound that starts at 3 a.m. and goes on until the sun rises. The noises are so much louder and pervasive than someone chewing potato chips with their mouth open. No matter what I try to block it out, it permeates through the defenses and echoes through my brain as loudly as microphone feedback. The horrid crunching sound punctuated by wet gulps and the occasional belch has become the soundtrack of my nightmares. Well, when I'm able to sleep long enough to dream, that is. I feel weird about bringing this up to Dave. Something in my mind is screaming out, saying that I absolutely cannot mention this to him, and I think I know why. Dave doesn't eat much. Aside from Sundays and the rare rib dinner, I never see him eat. He's so skinny that I suspect he struggles with some sort of eating disorder. I tried asking about this once in a roundabout way, and Dave had responded with, people often can't stomach the sight of my meals. So, yeah, probably an eating disorder. Since he's so small, he might have experienced some bullying in high school, or maybe grown up in poverty and developed some sort of issue with binging after he got money. Either way, that's just speculation. The little voice in my head keeps screaming to never break up the sounds because how awful would it be if I made him feel bad for simply eating at night? What if I worsened his condition? Would I have to watch Dave waste away because of a petty comment? I don't want to know the answer to those questions. All I know is he doesn't feel comfortable eating full meals in front of others very often. Again, it's been almost a year since he moved in, and he's still not even comfortable around me. Maybe he can sense my issue with him. I hope not, as I do think he's a wonderful person with the exception of this one petty thing. But back on topic, the chewing. The only thing I can think to compare it to is my mother's dog. She had a pit mix named Daisy as I was growing up. She was a beautiful dog with short black fur that loved cuddling and was the epitome of sweetness. I thought she couldn't hurt a fly, but that thought was revoked in a violent fashion. One day a friend of mine broke into our house. He was trying to pull a stupid prank and climb through the kitchen window in a scream mask intent on scaring me. And he did. I shrieked like a little girl and Daisy came barreling into the kitchen. I saw her mouth open. All of those white teeth suddenly looked much sharper as the muscles in her neck bulged. She seemed to practically soar past me. Daisy chomped into my friend's shoulder, knocking him down. There was this resounding crack as he fell. At first, I thought he'd hit his head on the counter, maybe even broken his neck, but the crack was actually Daisy, locking her jaw in place and crunching into his collarbone. On the ground, Daisy didn't let go. She kept her mouth rigidly shut and shook her head back and forth. There was a wet tearing noise that seemed even louder than the screaming. I remember thinking that she was ripping him apart. In the end, my friend was relatively okay. He had to have reconstructive surgery on his shoulder and was in physical therapy for the duration of our high school careers. He walked away with minor nerve damage and a near debilitating fear of dogs. The doctor said he got off lucky. I'll never forget the sound of Daisy crunching into his bone, ripping the flesh off of his body with unnatural ease. I couldn't believe sweet Daisy, who loved cuddles and once let a butterfly land on the tip of her nose, looked so natural with a mouthful of blood. I thought that she couldn't hurt a fly, but she nearly eviscerated my friend. Don't get me wrong, I still love Daisy, and when she was taken away for aggression testing and my mother told me it was likely she'd be put down, I sobbed for days. Daisy was my beloved pet, and I knew that untimely she had only tried to protect me from what both she and I had perceived to be a threat. I was just shocked by what she had done, or rather, I was shocked by what she was capable of. And now, the sounds I hear from Dave's bedroom, the sounds that I cannot block out with noise-canceling headphones or music, the sounds that permeate my nightmares. These sounds sound almost like Daisy, ripping the flesh and crunching the bone of a person. I don't know if this is some sort of latent PTSD thing. Maybe I'm just now facing the trauma of seeing that much blood and confronting the fear that a much younger me suppressed. Maybe there's a rational explanation for why I'm so frazzled. I shouldn't be able to hear him so clearly. There's no sound when he has a woman over. I know that the walls, well, not soundproof, are capable of blocking most noises. The smack of Dave's lips as he appreciates a meal shouldn't be able to reach me, but it does. I lay awake each night, headphones around my head, clutching the pillow against them for extra protection, and try to drown out the sound of Dave chewing. I don't have anyone to talk to about this. I only have a few friends, and if I said this to them, they'd either think I was crazy or petty. Probably both. So I'm just trying to get this off my chest and maybe get some advice from anyone else who couldn't seem to get over a petty grievance. Dave's been talking about renewing the lease. That we ought to stay roommates for another year, and I really can't think of a reason to say no because the only thing about Dave is that he chews too loud. My friend Miranda and I were having a sleepover at my grandmother's house. She lived in rural North Carolina on 3 acres with a mountain on one side and miles of woods on the other. The only road in her neighborhood was on the back side of her house, where the wraparound porch hugged the formal living room and a converted bedroom where guests stayed the night. The lot in front of her house that spanned over 4 miles was undeveloped. We started off the night watching TV and reading teen magazines, but it truly was an abysmal time. We didn't know it, but we were just about to outgrow each other, childhood friends with proximity alone. She was socially eclipsing me. At around 10-something, my grandmother went to sleep. We watched her take a sleeping pill and out on Nick at night. Her small old dog Lolita slept beside her already. She couldn't sleep without my grandfather, and after he died, the pills knocked her out. Miranda decided after not paying attention to the show she put on that we should go outside. It was rainy and windy, and it had finally stopped. We tiptoed through the long hallway and closed the door to the mudroom and put on boots and raincoats. She flopped around in my grandmother's and I put on my own shoes. We walked for a bit past the patio furniture, past the empty chicken coop, and past my grandfather's shed. The property was well kept to the perimeter fence, and we hopped over and made our way into the woods. We walked for a few seconds, and I look back towards the house. It disappears quickly, and we hop in puddles and shine our flashlights, at the trees, talking quietly and looking around, hoping to see an owl or a deer. I can't help but feel uneasy. I'm acting brave to save face. Miranda is almost 12 and I'm barely 10. I've never been out here without an adult before. The woods become thicker and we lose the path completely. I know I've never been this deep in these woods, and she just wants to go farther and farther, our lights illuminating less and less as the forest becomes more dense. The rain picks back up a bit and the wind moves the trees around us. We see them sway, but hear nothing. It's scary when you're out in the woods alone in the middle of the night. It's even scarier when between steps you hear leaves crunching and branches snapping. Miranda looks back at me and whispers, "Was that you?" I shake my head and we listen intently. The rain and the now audible wind make it so hard to zero in on the movement in the distance. I'm so scared, my heart is beating in my chest and we're both frozen. I want to be back at the house playing in the back bedroom, watching Law and Order and eating snacks. I turn off my light as the sound gets closer, and I back up slowly. I don't feel Miranda behind me anymore, and I turn around and she's gone. The branches are breaking and the crunching and squelching of the wet ground is so loud. And I see her a few feet back. She looks at me, her light still on. She shines it to the side of us, and she takes off running, leaving me alone in the woods. I sink to my knees. The cold water soaks my pajamas under the raincoat and cry silently. I hear something run somewhere past to my left, and I hold my breath and sink deeper into the ground. The crunching sounds move closer, the way we came, and eventually I stop hearing it altogether. I sat on the floor for a while and I feel the rain starting again. The wind knocks my hood down and the rain is so cold on my face. Cold water drops down my back and I shiver. I walk back the way I think I came and look around the entire time, feeling eyes all over me. I don't turn on my light. My eyes have finally adjusted to the dark. It had to have been at least an hour since Miranda and I got separated, and I was so upset that she left me. There's a huge tree that was struck by lightning a few years back, and a big chunk of it toppled over. It's a landmark I remember when I venture back here with my cousin, a few hundred meters from their house. I see the white fence behind the trees and run the last few feet out of the woods. I run as fast as I can and get to the house. I try the knob and the door is locked. Miranda locked me out of the house. I knock on the door and nothing. No lights on in my grandma's room or my great-grandmother's room. I hope Miranda will hear me, but the rain is pounding so hard. I'm sure I just sound like a whisper in the darkness. I suddenly feel sick to my stomach. I feel eyes on my back and I turn around and don't see anything but the normal stuff in the yard and the white fence and the wall of trees. I'm so thankful for the visibility, but I'm scared that I'm outside alone with whatever ran by after Miranda. After a few minutes, I can see a light come on in my great-grandmother's room. She wears a hearing aid, so chances are she didn't hear me knocking. And Lolita was so afraid of the storm she was probably shaking in the tub, not worried about me. I see her little old face in rollers, and I wave my hands. I feel the hair in the back of my neck raise, and I feel the danger. I feel so scared. She finally looks up and walks old people quickly to the door. She unlocks it and lets me take a step in before standing in front of me asking what happened. Why was I outside? She's fumbling with her hearing aid and I scoot past her. Tell her I wanted to get something I left out earlier, and the door must have closed and locked. I grabbed a towel and took off my clothes. I walked to the end of the hall looking out the windows, the whole time feeling so exposed. Miranda is sitting on the bed, watching TV, soaking the sheets, and not a bit concerned. I throw her the towel and she takes off her raincoat. We get clean, dry sheets and we lie in bed beside each other, neither of us talking. She faces the road and the porch, and I face the wall. I hear her gasp and push back against me, and I whisper what her problem is. She points to the window, which is illuminated every time the thunder strikes in the sky. We see something on all fours walking on the porch, stopping in front of the window. Then we see the vague silhouette. We're behind the curtain. I've never noticed the opacity of these curtains, so in the dark room, I'm hoping it can't see in. We stare where it stands or crouches or whatever, and the next time the sky is bright, it's moved somewhere else. I'm trying to look in. We are frozen in bed, not moving, not talking, not even breathing. But it just stayed there for a while. Then a lightning stroke came and it was gone. We stayed up for hours and waited for whatever it was to come back. Never did. In the morning, Miranda got ready. She brushed her teeth and got dressed all before my grandmother ever woke up to make us breakfast, which it seemed she had not intention of waiting for. She told me her mom was on the way to pick her up and that she had dance. But I knew she didn't want to have to be here any longer than she needed to. I asked her why she ran away, why she left me by myself and then locked the door. She kind of just stared at me and then kept packing up. She said she heard something moving in front of us, and she saw something moving when she shone her light over there. So she ran, and when she finally found the house, she didn't think it made sense to keep the door unlocked so whoever would just come in and take her. She didn't even think of me, of my life or my fear. Not even that it was her idea to go out there or anything. We didn't talk, and when Mom came before too long, we never hung out again. She moved on to cooler friends, and eventually my family left the state, but every time I'm in the woods, I can't help but think about what was out there with us, how close it seems we could have come to ending up dead. I remember seeing it on the wall in a Walmart. I always like to look at the missing kids and their names, as I would see someone who I know, and it would turn into this whole thing. What I never expected was to see a girl who had gone missing roughly 11 years ago. She had her brown hair in one of those layered ponytails where not all of the hair is in the ponytail, and a cute pale pink dress on. It looked like a school photo. The paper said her name was Natalia Davis. I had contorted my face at that, and the name sounded so familiar, like it was in memories I didn't have access to. I read the blurb of text, which was the longest out of the papers there. Natalia was last seen on July 4th, 2011. She had been reported to be taken from her parents by a white female and put into a car being driven by a white male. If you have any information, please call. I had stopped reading when I noticed the age progressed photo in the corner. She had long hair, the same shade of brown as the little girl. It was like staring in a mirror. The face shape, the eye and hair color. Hell, even the generic gray t-shirt put on every edited photo looked like a shirt I had at home. The only difference was that my hair was shorter than the photo. I didn't notice the fact I was shaking until I heard my mom call me from a few checkouts away. Without thinking, I snapped a picture of the poster and walked towards where my name was called. It was a silent road home. It was always silent with my mom, but this was different. I was still shaking and I assumed my face was pale. I shielded my phone screen from my mother and looked up the name. Of course, the first thing that came up was the girl. Apparently, it was a cold case from a small town in upstate New York. A girl that was sitting with her parents was snatched by a woman, drugged, and taken into a van where she and a man drove off. The van didn't have a license plate and was found abandoned near state borders between New York and Vermont. After that, every trace of Natalia and the two people who took her was gone. It was tragic, and everyone but her parents assumed she was dead. I read every article that had been written about it and stumbled upon the photo again. The age-progressed one, the one I could recreate with a wig and an edited background. I saved the photo and sent it and the original poster to my best friend. If anyone could talk about this with me and keep it secret, it was them. Before I could see their response, the car screeched to a halt. I snapped my head up into my mom in the driver's seat. She was gripping the steering wheel so hard her knuckles were turning white. She turned head to me and grabbed my phone. I yelped out something of a protest, but it was too late. "You know, don't you?" she asked while staring at the text. I nodded, stopped, and shook my head. I don't remember anything about Natalia Davis, though. I feel like if it happened when I was 5, I would remember it. My mom let out a slight laugh. It scared me. Trauma response, I assume. Or just memory erasure. We did, after all, give you chloroform to make you sleep until we could get a new car, but... She grabbed my hand and held it. I'm so glad we did it. I pulled my hand away and pushed myself as far back as possible away from her. I didn't know what to do. What I wanted to do was tuck my knees into my chest and cry. So I did the next best thing. I opened my car door and ran to a fence. I jumped it, hoping whoever's backyard this was wouldn't mind a teenager asking to use their phone. I banged on their back door, letting myself cry finally. The door opened to a bewildered man who was still in his sleep clothes. I sniffled and wiped my eyes. Can I use your phone to call 911? He fumbled awkwardly for his cell phone and handed it to me with the emergency call screen open. I sucked in breath and entered the 3 numbers. 911, what's your emergency? I took another breath. My name is Rue Parker. Or I thought it was, but I think I might be this missing kid from New York. It was a long afternoon that day. At some point while on the phone, my mom banged on the guy's door. He kept her there at the house until police showed up. He was super nice too. He told me he had a sister who went missing but was found dead, so he was more than happy to help me. My mother was arrested on the spot, and I was taken to the police station while they waited to contact my real parents. That was so weird to think about, but my DNA matched Natalia's. As I'm writing this, I am at home with my family. My real family. I still don't understand much of anything that happened. My mother, my biological one, she smells like cookies all the time and gives the best hugs. Got me into therapy to try and unlock memories of being this other girl. This Natalia Davis, but I'm Rue. It's hard and it feels like I had 2 lives dissolved at the same time, all because I wanted to go to Walmart with my mother. But hey, at least those age-progressed photos are accurate. First, I have to start off by saying that I don't know if I'm maybe just overreacting. There are definitely people out there who have worse neighbors. Hell, I'm sure there are people in my own city that have far worse neighbors. It all started about 2 months ago, maybe a bit more. I'm horrible with times and dates. I woke up to see a small little truck in the street in front of my apartment. 2 men unloading old furniture and boxes. I watched them for a bit, waiting to see which house they would carry all that stuff into, and I was surprised that they went through the door of my apartment complex. I didn't know there was an empty flat, which wasn't saying much since I didn't really pay attention to anything happening outside my own 4 walls. So it wasn't strange for me not to actually see my neighbors for the first few weeks. It was one of my other neighbors who told me about them. Colin something, I know his name, living right next to me, always trying to talk my ear off with his grating, nasal voice. Oh, have you seen the new neighbors? I just came home and was fumbling desperately for my keys. A fake smile on my face. An elderly lady and her husband. The woman is such a darling, she gave me cookies and soup after I helped her carry her groceries in. I nodded, fumbling for my keys harder, dropping them in the hurry. I really hated Colin, but I also didn't want him to know that. I always tried to be polite so he wouldn't piss on my doorstep or do something equally annoying in revenge. And trust me, that soup was marvelous. The best I ever had. When I asked her for a recipe though, she just winked. I finally had my keys in hand and jammed them into the lock, grinning at Colin and muttering about having to really get inside and having no time to talk. And that was that. A few days later, I actually met the elderly lady myself. She looked like the most grandmotherly person you could imagine. Paper thin, wrinkly skin, white hair and that short kind of cloud all older women seem to have. A beige shirt and cardigan, stockings, and those shiny black slip-on shoes. She was struggling with a large bag, so I rushed over to help her. Not because I'm a nice kind of guy. I just don't want to seem like an asshole to people I have to live next to, or in this case above. We went up 2 flights of stairs and through her front door. That's the first weird thing that I noticed. The flat was small, like my own, 2 rooms and a little kitchen, but it smelled very much not like mine. There was a sickly sweet odor hanging heavy in the air, making me choke lightly as I stepped in. I just assumed it was the regular old people smell that somehow found its place in every elderly person's home. So I set down the bag, getting a glimpse of some cabbages and carrots inside. The lady thanked me profusely and wouldn't let me leave until I accepted a bowl full of soup as a thanks. So I went home and had the best bowl of soup in my life. Colin had been right. There just was something about the tender meat, even though those bits were few. The rest was cabbage, carrot, potato, all good, but not as good as the few scraps of meat that swam in between. The second strange thing I noticed happened over the next few weeks. I ran into her often since that first time. She seemed to go grocery shopping every second day or so, probably since she couldn't carry that much at once. I always helped her with the bag, and she always thanked me with a bowl of soup, sometimes the same as the first time, sometimes potato and chives or peas and beans, but always with a few tiny scraps of delicious meat. The strange thing wasn't the soup, though. It was that I didn't see her husband even once. It was as if she lived alone. The flat silent whenever we entered. I asked her once and she simply said that he usually took a nap around this time. I guess that makes sense. Old people like to take naps, right? It's just that we often ran into each other at different times of the day. And somehow I still didn't see her husband. The third strange thing is the one that's been bothering me enough that I started to actually wonder about my new neighbors. Their flat is right below mine, the layout the same, so my bedroom is right above theirs. It's been only a few days, but I started to notice the weird smell in my own bedroom. I have no way to prove it, but since it smells exactly like the old lady's living room, and probably the whole apartment, I assume it's coming from downstairs. Sweet, nauseating. Kind of like when you hurt yourself and the wound gets infected. It's all very minor, so I didn't bother to really spend much time thinking about it. But then the fourth strange thing happened and I thought, maybe this is something to share here. See, I got another bowl of soup and I'm half sure that my mind or my eyes might have played tricks on me. But I think I saw a little piece of finger, nail and all floating in there. The actually strange thing, though, is that I couldn't stop myself from eating it anyway. The meat is just so tender and juicy, and each bowl has so few scraps of it in it. This happened in 2008 when I was 13. I remember it like it was yesterday. I lived in Cincinnati at the time, and it was January. My middle school was called off due to a snowstorm the night before. I was home alone because my dad and stepmom had to go to work, which meant my little sister was at daycare and my older brother had a dentist appointment. My dad worked for lawn care and sometimes came home for lunch if he was in the area. So when I was awoken by noises coming from the basement, I thought it was just him home for lunch going through things in the basement. So I really didn't think anything of it. When I got out of bed, I could still hear what I thought was my dad in the basement, but as I approached the stairs, something felt extremely off. I really don't know what caused me to do this, but instead of yelling, I whispered, "Dad, is that you?" He didn't respond. So I quietly went to the front door and looked out of the tiny square window and saw two men walking up the snow-covered hill to my backyard. I found out later that there was a third man, and he was the one who broke the basement window. I quickly realized the noises I heard was actually the basement window directly under my bed in the basement being broken. I ran back to my bedroom, immediately hopped into my closet, and called my mom. When she answered and I told her what was happening, she called my brother to see if he would go home because I had a history of being scared to be home alone. So neither of them actually believed that there were people in the house. Before my brother got there, and right after my mother and I got off the phone, I called 911. I don't think the dispatcher believed me at first because she asked me several times if I was sure there were people trying to enter my house. Meanwhile, the three men had already entered the house and were hauling ass up the basement stairs. After I told her that, I immediately noticed a change in her voice, and she told me to stay calm and asked me if I was in a safe place, to which I told her I was inside my bedroom closet. Except the door wouldn't close all the way because, as most teenagers, my room was only clean because I threw a lot of stuff in my closet. So I had to hold my closet door shut. The dispatcher told me to let her know what I could hear, if anything. I told her that I heard them talking to each other in the living room, but I couldn't understand what they were saying. The next thing I knew, they were breaking down my dad and stepmom's bedroom door that was right next to my room. Not long after that, I see through the crack of my closet door. One of the men entered my room, and a few seconds later he walked back out, obviously realizing it was a child's bedroom and that he wasn't going to find anything worthwhile in there. A few moments later, one of the men shouted, "He's home! He's home!" And they all started running away, or so I thought. A little backstory about the house. It was fairly old, so to open all the windows, even the basement, you had to crank a lever to open or close them, unlike the glass block windows that can't be broken or seen through. Not only that, but the front door didn't open because the house had settled too much and wouldn't unlock, so the couch was in front of it. Because the front door didn't work, we used the same door to get in and out. I'm not sure why, but the side door had to be unlocked with a key from the inside of the house to be able to leave. Everybody had a key besides my little sister. That being said, the men had to leave the way they entered, with everything they were trying to steal, which was through the basement window. After the dispatcher informed me that the police and my house surrounded, and it was safe to come out, it took me quite a while to leave my closet because I didn't truly know if they were gone. When I finally got the balls to get out, I grabbed my key and darted to the side door to let the police inside. I didn't see my brother anywhere, so I didn't know if something had happened to him or if he was even him who came. Not long after I let the police inside, my brother came walking inside the dining room. I jumped up so fast and gave him the biggest hug I had ever given him. When the police asked us to tell them what happened, I heard my brother tell them that when he got to the house, he walked up to the side door like he normally would, and when he was about to unlock it, he was met with one of the men through the window. He said the man cocked his gun, put it up to the glass and said, "Hey, bitch." After that, he said he froze up and then he could finally feel his legs again. He ran up the street and started knocking on doors. After about 3 houses, he knocked on the 4th, and a little girl answered, so he asked her to go and get her mommy. When the woman came to the door, she could see that he was frazzled and asked him what was wrong. He told her that there were men inside of our house and his little sister was inside. She called the police, and my then brother called our grandparents to let them know that I was telling the truth. I asked the officers if they caught the men, and he assured me that they did. A little while later, a police car pulled up to the front of my house, and they had one of the men stand outside of it for my brother to identify the one who pulled the gun out on him. I was so happy that they were all caught and that we were safe. My grandparents and my mom both got there around the same time, and I just remember them all rushing up to hug me. My mom then called my dad, who rushed home, and my stepmom wasn't too far behind him. Understandingly, my dad let me go with my mom and stay at her house for a few days, and I also didn't go to school. The township reached out to my dad and invited us to come to the town center about a week after the break-in. When we got there, I was surrounded by the officers who were there that day and apprehended the men, and they awarded me with a certificate of bravery for staying calm and helping them catch the men, along with a little gift bag of girly items. About a month later, we had to go to the men's court date, where we met a woman and her son in the waiting area that had their house broken into a week before our house got broken into by the same men, who just so happened to steal one of the guns she had. As it turns out, the 2 men had 3 guns, but only one of them was loaded. I was too overwhelmed to be in the courtroom and have to see the men again, so the judge allowed us to stay in the waiting area until their hearing was over. 2 of the men ended up getting 7 years in prison, and the other got 12 because he pulled a gun on my brother. They're all out of prison now, and for a little while, I was scared that they would come back once they got out because my dad still lives there. But nothing has happened since that day. I've always heard stories about houses getting broken into, but I never thought it would happen to me. I'm really glad that I was old enough to know what to do in that situation, and that the men never knew I was in the house with them until they were in court, because who knows what they could have done.